The morning Marcus Ashford told me to train his daughter as the new chief financial officer, I was standing in the executive parking garage of Halberd Capital, watching him step out of a leased silver sedan he could not actually afford. It was 7:43 in the morning, and the September air was cold enough that his breath fogged in front of his mouth when he called out to me across the concrete floor. He was wearing a navy overcoat that still had the price tag tucked into the inner lining, a detail I noticed because he had asked me to help him pick it out at a men's warehouse 3 weeks earlier. He had wanted to look presidential for the board photograph. I had wanted to tell him he could not photograph his way into competence, but I had not said that. I never said things like that. I simply nodded, offered a mild suggestion about the shoulder fit, and paid for my coffee. I was 58 years old, and I had been the chief financial officer of Halberd Capital for 13 years. I had built the finance department from a single beat-up laptop and a stack of receipts held together with a binder clip into a fully compliant, audited, revenue-generating engine that supported 140 employees across 3 offices. Marcus was the founder, technically, but Marcus had inherited a small commercial real estate holding from his father in 2011. And everything after that, every deal, every acquisition, every restructuring, had run through my desk. I had personally underwritten the 2 properties that had turned Halberd into a genuine firm. I had sat across from 3 different regional banks and negotiated the credit lines that had kept us alive during the 2020 liquidity crisis. And I had done it all while Marcus was in Aspen, or in the Hamptons, or on one memorable occasion, in a rehabilitation facility in Malibu that we had labeled as an executive wellness retreat on the quarterly filings. None of that appeared to matter on that particular Tuesday morning. Marcus walked toward me with the loose, confident stride of a man who had rehearsed his lines in the mirror. And he smiled the kind of smile a used car dealer offers a first-time buyer. He clapped my shoulder as if we were old college friends, which we were not, and he told me, in a voice loud enough that the security guard at the elevator bank could hear, that he had wonderful news for the future of Halberd Capital. His daughter, Chelsea, was coming aboard as the incoming chief financial officer. She had just completed her Master of Business Administration program at a private university in Southern California, and she was ready to bring, in his words, fresh energy and modern thinking to the leadership team. I said nothing. I let him talk. He continued. He explained, without ever quite looking at me, that I would be transitioning into an advisory role. My salary would be adjusted accordingly. My office would be reassigned. Chelsea would need my current corner space for her onboarding period, which he estimated would last 12 to 18 months. During that time, I would be responsible for training her on every process, every relationship, every account, and every internal system I had built over the past 13 years. He said the word onboarding 4 times in 90 seconds. He said the word transition 3 times. He never once said the word thank. I stood there in the parking garage, holding my cardboard coffee cup, watching the steam rise into the cold air, and I let Marcus finish his monologue. He seemed to want a reaction from me. He kept pausing after each sentence, tilting his head slightly, waiting for the wounded look, the polite protest, perhaps the beginning of a negotiation. I gave him none of those things. I simply nodded once, told him I understood, and asked what time he wanted the transition meeting to begin. He looked briefly disappointed. The way a man looks when he has prepared a difficult conversation and the other party refuses to make it difficult. He said 9 o'clock in the main conference room, and then he walked off toward the elevator, his overcoat flapping behind him like the cape of a discount magician. I took the freight elevator up. I had always preferred the freight elevator. It was slower, less crowded, and it opened directly into the back corridor near the accounting archives, which meant I could reach my office without passing through the reception area or the open plan bullpen, where the analysts would inevitably ask me questions I did not yet want to answer. I unlocked my door, hung my coat on the wooden rack in the corner, and sat down at my desk. The desk was mahogany, purchased at an estate sale in 2015 for $312. I had refinished it myself, in my garage, on weekends. Marcus had once asked if the company had bought it. I had told him no. He had not asked again. I opened the bottom drawer on the left side of the desk, the one with the small brass lock, and I retrieved a slim leather portfolio. Inside the portfolio were 3 documents. The first was my original employment agreement, dated March of 2012. The second was a stock purchase agreement, dated November of 2013. The third was an amended shareholder agreement, dated April of 2015, executed shortly after Marcus had returned from his wellness retreat and needed emergency capital to close a struggling acquisition in the industrial corridor outside Cleveland. I had loaned the firm $400,000 of my personal savings that spring. In exchange, Marcus had signed over a substantial equity position, drawn up by his own attorney, notarized in the presence of 2 witnesses, and filed with our corporate registry. I own 40% of Halberd Capital. Not options, not a promise, not a phantom equity plan that would vest upon some vague future milestone. 40% of the common voting stock, fully paid, fully vested, and fully protected under a shareholder agreement that included specific language regarding management changes, executive appointments, and any material alteration of the company's governance structure. Marcus had signed it in a panic, at a Denny's off the interstate, at 11 o'clock at night. Because his other options at that moment had been personal bankruptcy or begging his father-in-law for money, and he had preferred neither. I had known, even then, that he would eventually forget. Marcus was a man who forgot things that were inconvenient to remember. He had forgotten our anniversary lunch every year for 13 years. He had forgotten the names of the 2 junior analysts he had personally hired the previous spring. And he had apparently forgotten that the woman he was now planning to install as chief financial officer of his family firm would need the written consent of a shareholder who was currently sitting in the corner office he wanted to reassign. I placed the leather portfolio on the center of my desk and looked at it for a long moment. Then I closed the drawer, locked it, and opened my email. There were 47 unread messages, most of them routine, but one had arrived at 6:42 that morning from Chelsea Ashford herself. The subject line read, in cheerful lowercase letters, "So excited to work together," with 2 exclamation points. I opened it. The message was 3 paragraphs long. It informed me that she had already reviewed some of the company's public filings and had a few thoughts on how our accounting department could be modernized. She wanted to know if I could clear my calendar for the following 2 weeks so she could shadow me. She signed the message with her first name, followed by a small emoji of a coffee cup. I did not reply. I closed the message and opened a new document. I began to write, in the calm and precise way I had written thousands of memoranda over the past 13 years, a summary of the shareholder agreement, the specific clauses that governed executive appointments, and the procedural requirements for any board-level personnel decision involving the chief financial officer position. It took me 40 minutes. When I finished, I saved the document, printed 2 copies, and placed them in a manila folder. I did not label the folder. I did not need to. At 8:15, my assistant, a quiet woman named Priscilla, who had worked for me for 9 years, knocked on my door and entered with the morning's mail. She was carrying a small stack of envelopes and a paper cup from the coffee shop on the ground floor. She set the cup on the coaster beside my keyboard, exactly where she always set it, and she looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for mornings when she had already heard something in the hallway. Priscilla was the kind of person who knew every rumor in the building before the person the rumor was about had even heard it. I nodded at her, and she nodded back, and neither of us said anything for a few seconds. Then she asked me, in a low voice, if it was true that Chelsea was starting today. I said yes. She asked if it was true that Chelsea was being brought on as the new chief financial officer. I said that was what Marcus had told me. She asked what that meant for me. I told her that we would find out at 9 o'clock. She held my gaze for another moment, and then she gave me a small, tight smile. The kind of smile a longtime colleague offers when she has known you long enough to understand that you are not asking for her sympathy. She left the office and closed the door behind her without a sound. I drank my coffee. I reviewed the shareholder agreement one final time, running my finger along the specific paragraph that Marcus had signed at that Denny's on the interstate. The language was tight. My personal attorney, a woman named Harriet Kowalski, had drafted it herself and had walked me through every clause line by line before I had signed my portion. Harriet had been my counsel since the mid-90s, back when I had first begun accumulating a small portfolio of consulting clients on the side. She had once told me, over a plate of pierogi at a Polish restaurant in the suburbs, that the single most valuable thing a professional could own was not money or reputation, but an ironclad piece of paper signed by someone who had not read it carefully enough. I had never forgotten that advice. At 8:45, I gathered my materials, adjusted my tie in the small mirror behind my office door, and walked down the main corridor toward the conference room. I passed the accounting bullpen on the way. The junior analysts were huddled around Vincent's desk, whispering about something, and they went silent the moment they saw me. Vincent, a young man I had hired the previous year straight out of his master's program, offered me a small, uncertain nod. I nodded back and kept walking. I did not slow down. I did not stop to chat. Whatever was going to happen in the next hour did not require an audience, and I did not intend to give the office one. The main conference room was at the far end of the executive corridor. It featured a long walnut table, 12 leather chairs, and a wall of windows overlooking the parking structure and the small strip of manicured lawn that Marcus had insisted on installing 3 years earlier, despite my strong objection to the cost. When I walked in, Marcus was already seated at the head of the table. Chelsea was seated to his right. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer, a matching skirt, and a pair of pointed leather flats that appeared to have never touched pavement. She was scrolling on her phone with one hand and sipping from a bottle of coconut water with the other. She did not look up when I entered. Also at the table was Bradley Merton, our outside legal counsel. Bradley was a man in his early 60s who had represented Halberd Capital since the company's founding. He was a decent attorney, methodical and calm, though he had a habit of deferring to Marcus on matters where he should have pushed back harder. He gave me a professional nod. I returned it. There was also a fourth person at the table, a young woman in her late 20s whom I did not recognize. She was seated to Chelsea's right, holding a tablet and a stylus, and she wore a small pin on her lapel that identified her as an associate at a public relations firm downtown. I made a mental note of her presence and said nothing. Marcus stood as I approached my seat. He gestured broadly, in the way that game show hosts gesture toward the winning contestant, and he announced that this was going to be a wonderful morning for the future of Halberd Capital. He said the word future twice. He said the word exciting 3 times. He introduced Chelsea to me as if we had never met. Though she had attended 2 of our holiday parties and had once at the age of 19 thrown up in the potted ficus tree beside the reception desk. He described her academic background, her recent internship at a boutique advisory firm in Santa Monica, and her, quote, natural instinct for financial leadership. Chelsea smiled without looking up from her phone. Then Marcus turned to me. He smiled that used car dealer smile again, the one he had rehearsed in the parking garage, and he asked me the question he had been building toward all morning. He asked if I was ready to onboard her. I let the question hang in the air for a moment. I placed my manila folder on the table in front of me. I opened it slowly. I removed the top document, which was the amended shareholder agreement, and I slid it across the walnut surface until it stopped precisely in front of Bradley Merton. Then I looked up at Marcus, and I smiled. I said no, I own 40%. For a full 3 seconds, nobody in the conference room made a sound. Chelsea's thumb stopped scrolling. The young public relations associate looked up from her tablet with the slightly confused expression of someone who had been briefed on a script that no longer matched the scene in front of her. Marcus's smile remained on his face, but it had frozen in place, the way a photograph freezes an expression after the moment of genuine feeling has already passed. Only Bradley Merton reacted with any real focus. He picked up the document I had slid across the table, adjusted his reading glasses, and began to scan the first page with the practiced efficiency of a man who had reviewed thousands of contracts in his career. Marcus recovered first. He laughed. It was a short, uncertain laugh. The kind of laugh a man produces when he is not sure whether he has just heard a joke. He said, "Come on, that's not funny," and he looked around the table for support, but none was forthcoming. Chelsea was staring at me now, her coconut water halfway to her lips slightly parted. Bradley had already turned to the second page of the agreement. I did not laugh. I did not repeat myself. I did not need to. I simply reached into the manila folder and removed the second document, which was the stock purchase agreement from November of 2013, and I placed it beside the first document in front of Bradley. Then I removed the third document, the original loan agreement from the spring of 2015, the one Marcus had signed at that Denny's off the interstate, and I placed it beside the second. I closed the folder. I folded my hands on top of it. I waited. Bradley Merton looked up from the papers. He looked at Marcus. He looked at me. Then he cleared his throat, adjusted his tie, and said, in the careful voice attorneys use when they are about to explain something extremely inconvenient to their client, "Marcus, we should probably discuss this in private before we continue with the morning's agenda." Marcus's face began to change color. Not in a dramatic way, not the sudden flush of anger, but a slower, more subterranean change. The kind of color that rises in a man's cheeks when he begins to remember something he has spent years forgetting. His eyes flickered toward the third document, the one from Denny's. His mouth opened slightly. He said nothing. Chelsea, who had apparently decided that the moment required her participation, set down her coconut water and turned to her father. She asked in the bright, confident tone of a young woman who had never encountered a room that was not arranged in her favor. What any of this had to do with her onboarding? Nobody answered her. Bradley was reading the fourth paragraph of the amended shareholder agreement, his lips moving silently as he traced the language regarding executive appointments. Marcus was still staring at the Denny's document. The public relations associate was very carefully turning her tablet face down on the table. I decided at that moment to help move the conversation forward. I addressed myself to Bradley since he was the only person in the room who was actually reading the paperwork. I said, calmly and without emphasis, that the amended shareholder agreement executed in April of 2015 included specific language requiring the unanimous written consent of all shareholders holding 25% or more of the common voting stock for any executive appointment at the level of Chief Financial Officer or above. Bradley Merton lowered the document to the table. He removed his reading glasses, folded them carefully, and placed them in the breast pocket of his suit jacket. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at Chelsea. He looked at me, and he gave me the small, professional nod of a lawyer who has just confirmed the accuracy of a statement he wishes his client had made him aware of sooner. Then he turned to Marcus and said, in the same careful voice he had used a moment earlier, that the language I had described was in fact present in the agreement, and that any appointment to the Chief Financial Officer position without the written consent of a 25% shareholder would constitute a material breach of the corporate governance provisions. Marcus finally spoke. He said that agreement was under duress. His voice was thin. It cracked slightly on the second syllable of the word duress, and I could hear him try to pull it back into the register he had been using earlier, the confident baritone he reserved for board meetings and dinner parties, but it would not return. Bradley closed his eyes briefly, the way a man closes his eyes when he has just heard his client volunteer a fact that will almost certainly make the situation worse. Then he opened them and said, in a voice that was now noticeably quieter, that duress was a specific legal claim requiring specific evidentiary standards, and that the agreement had been signed with independent counsel present, notarized by a licensed notary public, and filed with the state corporate registry within the statutory window. He did not need to say the rest. Everyone at the table who understood contract law understood the rest. Chelsea looked between her father and Bradley. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the public relations associate, who was now studying the pattern of the walnut grain on the tabletop with intense interest. Chelsea said, "Wait, She said the word slowly, drawing it out, and then she said it again. She said, "Wait, is this a joke? Dad, is this a joke?" Marcus did not answer her. Marcus was looking at the Denny's document again, and I could see, in the slight movement of his jaw, that he was beginning to reconstruct, piece by piece, the exact circumstances of that November night 11 years earlier. The panic, the cold coffee, the waitress who had refilled their cups 3 times without being asked, the ballpoint pen with the chewed cap that he had used to sign his name. I let the silence continue. I had learned, over the course of a long career, that silence in a conference room is the single most powerful negotiating instrument available to a person who has already won the substantive argument. The people who lose their composure in a room like that are almost always the people who feel the need to fill the silence. I did not feel that need. I sat with my hands folded on top of my manila folder, and I looked at Marcus with an expression of mild, patient inquiry, the way a physician looks at a patient who has just been asked to describe his symptoms. Bradley Merton took a slow breath. He said, "Marcus, I think we need to end this meeting and reconvene privately." Marcus did not respond. Bradley said his name again, slightly louder. Marcus looked up. His eyes were unfocused, the way a man's eyes go unfocused when he is running calculations in his head that he does not want to be running. He nodded once, then he stood up. His chair scraped against the floor. He did not look at me. He did not look at Chelsea. He walked out of the conference room. He did not close the door behind him. Bradley Merton gathered the 3 documents from the table, placed them carefully in a leather folio of his own, and followed Marcus out into the corridor. The public relations associate collected her tablet, her stylus, and her handbag with the quiet efficiency of a person who had realized that whatever event she had been hired to document was not going to occur, and she departed without a word. That left me and Chelsea alone in the conference room. Chelsea sat very still. She was still holding her coconut water. She stared at the door for a long moment, as if waiting for her father to reappear and explain that this had all been an elaborate misunderstanding. When it became clear that he was not returning, she turned to me. Her expression had shifted. The bright confidence of the young woman who had walked into the room 40 minutes earlier had drained away. And in its place was something more complicated. A mixture of embarrassment, confusion, and I thought a small flicker of genuine anger. She was not angry at me. She was angry at her father, though she did not yet know how to say so. She asked me, in a voice much quieter than the one she had used earlier, what had just happened. I looked at her for a moment. She was 26 years old. She had a master's degree from a reputable program. She had done nothing wrong in this particular meeting. Other than accept a job she had every reason to believe her father had the authority to offer her. I decided to be honest with her, because honesty seemed to be the only thing left in the room that had any value. I told her that her father had, 11 years ago, borrowed a significant amount of money from me at a moment when the company had been in serious financial distress. I told her that, in exchange for that loan, he had signed an agreement transferring a substantial equity position to me and had further agreed to specific governance protections that limited his ability to make unilateral executive appointments. I told her that I had held those shares and those protections quietly and without ever exercising them in a public way for the entire 11 years since. I told her that I had done so out of genuine loyalty to the company and out of a mistaken belief that her father remembered our arrangement. I told her, finally, that I had said nothing this morning until he had directly asked me a question that required an honest answer. Chelsea listened. She did not interrupt me. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she asked me if her father had truly forgotten. I told her that I did not know, but that I suspected he had chosen not to remember, which was, in my experience, a slightly different thing. She nodded. She looked down at her coconut water. She said, in a voice so quiet I almost did not hear her, that her father had promised her the chief financial officer position 4 months earlier, over dinner at his club in Bel Air. and that he had told her the current chief financial officer was, quote, an old man ready to retire who would be grateful for the opportunity to mentor a young talent. I did not react to this. I simply nodded once and let her continue. She looked up at me. She asked me what was going to happen next. I told her that I did not know, but that I had a strong suspicion the answer would be revealed in the next few hours. Chelsea gathered her things and left the conference room. She did not say goodbye. I remained in my seat for another minute or two, looking out the window at the parking structure and the small strip of manicured lawn, and then I stood, straightened my tie, and walked back to my office. Priscilla was at her desk. She looked up as I approached. She did not ask me any questions. She simply nodded, and I nodded back, and I closed my office door behind me. I sat down at my mahogany desk and opened a new document on my computer. I began to draft, in the same calm and precise language I had used 1,000 times before, a formal notice under the amended shareholder agreement. The notice would inform the board of directors that a proposed executive appointment had been made without the required consent of a 25% shareholder, and that any attempt to proceed with such an appointment would be a material breach of the governance provisions. I did not send the notice. I saved it as a draft. I wanted Marcus to have a chance to think first. At 10:17, my desk phone rang. It was Bradley Merton. He asked, in a professional but strained voice, if I would be willing to join him and Marcus in Marcus's office for a private conversation. I told him I would be there in 5 minutes. I gathered the manila folder, took a fresh legal pad from my desk drawer, and walked down the corridor to the corner office at the opposite end of the executive floor. Marcus's office was substantially larger than mine. It featured a glass-top desk that had cost the company $11,000, a leather sofa, a bar cart stocked with 3 varieties of scotch, and a large abstract painting that Marcus had once described to a visiting client as an important piece by an emerging artist, though I happened to know he had purchased it at a hotel gift shop in Miami. Marcus was seated behind his desk when I entered. He was not wearing his overcoat any longer. His tie had been loosened. His face had the particular gray tone of a man who had recently vomited or was considering doing so. Bradley Merton was seated in one of the 2 guest chairs. He gestured for me to take the other. I sat down. I placed the manila folder on my lap. I waited. Marcus began by apologizing. It was a strange, meandering apology, delivered without eye contact, that began with a general acknowledgement that the morning had not gone the way he had intended, and then wandered through several unrelated topics before eventually returning to something resembling the original point. He said he had not, quote, fully appreciated the terms of our earlier arrangement. He said he had been under significant personal stress at the time of the 2015 agreement. He said he hoped we could find a way to move forward, together, in a spirit of partnership. He used the word partnership 4 times in 90 seconds. He never once used the word sorry. I let him finish. When he was done, I looked at Bradley, and Bradley looked at me. And there was a brief moment of professional understanding between us. Bradley was not enjoying this. Bradley was, in fact, deeply embarrassed on behalf of his client, though he was too well trained to show it. He was here to negotiate, and he wanted me to know that he was here to negotiate in good faith. I opened the manila folder. I removed a single sheet of paper, one I had prepared in the 20 minutes between the conference room and Marcus's office. I placed the sheet of paper on Marcus's glass top desk and slid it across to Bradley. Bradley picked it up. He read it. Then he read it again, more slowly. Then he handed it to Marcus, without comment, and folded his hands in his lap. The sheet contained 4 items. The first item was a formal acknowledgement to be signed by Marcus and countersigned by Bradley as corporate counsel, confirming the validity and full enforceability of the amended shareholder agreement dated April of 2015. The second item was the immediate withdrawal of the proposed appointment of Chelsea Ashford to the position of Chief Financial Officer, along with a written commitment that no future executive appointment at that level would be made without my prior written consent, as required by the existing agreement. The third item was a restructuring of my role within the company. I would step down from the day-to-day chief financial officer position, effective on a mutually agreed date within the next 90 days, and I would transition into the position of chairman of the board of directors, with full voting rights, a modest annual retainer, and the specific authority to approve all future senior executive hires. The fourth item was a buyout provision. Marcus, or the company, would have the option to purchase my 40% equity position at any time within the next 3 years, at a valuation determined by an independent third-party appraiser mutually agreed upon by both parties, with the transaction structured as an installment sale over 60 months for tax efficiency. Marcus read the sheet 3 times. His face went through several colors during those 3 readings. He finally looked up at me and asked, in a voice that was attempting to sound reasonable, but was mostly succeeding at sounding exhausted, whether these terms were, quote, really necessary. I told him that they were not necessary. I told him that the alternative was that I would exercise my rights under the existing agreement, file the formal notice of breach with the board of directors, and, if he attempted to proceed with Chelsea's appointment anyway, pursue the matter through the appropriate legal channels. I told him that I had no particular desire to do any of those things, and that my proposed terms represented, in my honest professional judgment, the most efficient path forward for everyone involved, including his daughter, who deserved better than to be installed in a position she was not yet qualified to hold and then blamed for the resulting consequences when the arrangement collapsed under its own weight. Marcus did not respond immediately. He looked at Bradley. Bradley, in the careful voice of an attorney who has decided that his duty of candor to his client outweighs his duty to make his client feel comfortable, said that the terms I had proposed were, in his professional opinion, extraordinarily reasonable given the circumstances, and that he strongly recommended that Marcus accept them without further negotiation. Marcus did not respond to Bradley either. He simply sat behind his glass-topped desk, holding the sheet of paper in his hand, and stared out the window at the same parking structure I had been looking at from the conference room 40 minutes earlier. I let the silence continue. I had nothing to add. The terms were on the table. The alternative was clearly worse for Marcus than the terms themselves. There was no additional argument I could make that would improve my position, and there was no additional pressure I needed to apply. I simply waited, with the same patient inquiry I had shown in the conference room, and I let him arrive at his conclusion in his own time. Marcus signed the term sheet at 10:53 that morning. He did so without further protest, though he did not look at me when he handed the sheet back to Bradley for the countersignature. Bradley countersigned, dated the document, and made a photocopy on the small machine in the corner of Marcus's office. He handed me the original. I placed it in the manila folder, closed the folder, and stood up to leave. I paused at the door. I turned back to Marcus and told him, in the same calm voice I had used throughout the morning, that I remained committed to the long-term success of Halbert Capital, and that I looked forward to working with him in my new capacity as chairman of the board. He nodded without looking up. I left. Chelsea did not become the chief financial officer. She did, however, remain at the firm, in a genuine entry-level position within the corporate development group, reporting to a senior analyst named Thomas, who had 11 years of relevant experience and no personal relationship with her father. To her credit, and somewhat to my surprise, she accepted the arrangement without complaint. Over the following 18 months, she proved herself to be a genuinely capable young professional, curious, hardworking, and, once she had been separated from her father's expectations, entirely willing to learn. I met with her privately once a quarter at my request, and I offered her the mentorship her father had promised but never delivered. She thanked me once at the end of our 4th meeting, and I told her that she owed me no thanks. I told her that I had, at her age, been given a similar chance by a woman named Harriet Kowalski over a plate of pierogi at a Polish restaurant in the suburbs, and that I was simply passing the favor forward. Marcus and I established a functional working relationship. It was not warm. It would never again be warm, but it was professional, and it was governed by clear written agreements that neither of us needed to remember, because both of us had copies filed in fireproof boxes and with independent counsel. He never again made a significant business decision without consulting me first. I never again spent a morning cleaning coffee machines or absorbing casual insults in parking garages. The arrangement suited both of us, in the way that arrangements between people who have stopped pretending to like each other often do. 19 months after that morning in the conference room, Marcus exercised the buyout provision. An independent appraiser valued my 40% position at $22,400,000. The transaction was structured as a 60-month installment sale at a favorable interest rate, secured by a portion of the company's real estate holdings. I retained my position as chairman of the board through the end of the buyout period, and I stepped down from that role. At a modest retirement ceremony attended by most of the staff on a Tuesday afternoon in the following spring, I spent that summer in a small cottage on the coast of Maine, which I purchased outright with the proceeds of the first installment payment. Priscilla, my longtime assistant, came to visit me there in August, along with her husband and their 2 grandchildren. We drank coffee on the porch, and we watched the boats in the harbor, and we did not talk about Halbert Capital. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever held a card no one at the table knew you were holding?